Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're going to be tackling something that I think pretty much everyone struggles with at some point.
Mm,
And that is how to be really effective at managing a team.
yeah, it's definitely one of those things that can seem so simple at first glance, but then you actually get into it and it gets really complicated really quickly.
Right. It's like one of those things you don't know how hard it is until you've actually had to do it yourself. So for today's deep dive, we're actually taking some inspiration from across the pond. We've got this whole stack of guides and articles, and they're all from this French company called Popwork. Have you ever heard of them?
Yeah, I've come across them before. What's so interesting about them to me is how they really focus on making a structured approach to management.
Yeah. They have this really interesting philosophy. It's not just focusing on the tasks or the projects themselves, but the human side of things, the
Mhm.
relationships, the communication, just like the overall team dynamic.
Exactly. And that's something that really stood out to me when I was looking through this material for the first time.
Exactly. And one of the things that really jumped out at me was this concept of management rituals.
Oh, yeah.
It sounded kind of formal at first, but then I realized it's all about just creating consistency for the team, which actually makes a lot of sense when you think about it, right? Like if you're working on a team and you always kind of know what to expect next, it really cuts down on uncertainty and stress, which is something we could all use less of.
That's such a good point, and it actually connects really well with one of their strongest recommendations. And that is that managers should never, ever cancel a one-on-one meeting with someone on their team, even when things get super busy.
Yeah, that's something I've definitely been guilty of in the past, canceling the occasional meeting to try and free up some time, especially, if I was having a crazy week. But I think seeing how much pop work emphasizes this has really made me realize that it's about way more than just the logistics of it.
Yeah, for sure. You have to try and think about it from the team member's perspective. Like, that consistent meeting time is a dedicated space for them to connect with their manager, to share their progress, get support, all that. And when you cancel it, even if it's for what seems like a really valid reason, it can accidentally send this message that they're not actually a priority.
It's almost like you're saying their time isn't as valuable as whatever else is on your plate,
Exactly.
which is definitely not the message you want to be sending if you're trying to build trust and a sense of mutual respect on your team.
100%. And actually, speaking of priorities, Popwork also has some really interesting advice when it comes to setting objectives for your team.
Mm.
So, they do touch on some of those familiar frameworks like SMART goals, but what really stood out to me was the emphasis on limiting the number of objectives that a team should be focused on at any given time.
Okay.
They say you should really try to stick to 3 to 5 max.
See, that's where I always get a little bit tripped up because in my mind, I'm like, more goals equals more ambition, right? Like if a team has a lot of goals, that means they're really driven.
Right. And it's not about limiting your ambition, it's more about channeling it effectively. So, Popwork's point is that if you've got too many objectives kind of floating around at the same time, everything just gets super diluted and people start to lose focus. Priorities get unclear, and that whole to-do list mentality can really start to creep in.
Yeah.
So by narrowing the focus down to just those few key objectives, and they actually even recommend having one that's specifically focused on personal growth, you can actually create a much clearer path forward for everyone on your team.
So it's almost like a paradox, right? Like by setting fewer goals, you actually increase your chances of achieving them because everyone's energy is more focused.
Yeah, exactly. It's all about quality over quantity. And this leads us really nicely into another one of Popwork's big, I guess, approaches, which is the idea of the manager as a coach. So they really seem to advocate for this less directive style of management, the kind that really empowers a team to find their own solutions rather than just being told what to do.
And they have this really cool model for that. It's called GOW. I'm not
Yeah.
sure if you've heard of that.
Yeah, yeah.
But it seems like such a good framework for guiding those coaching conversations. Can you maybe just break it down for us a little bit?
Yeah, for sure. So GIRO stands for goal, reality, options, and willingness.
Okay.
So it starts with the, team member. We can call them the collaborator.
Good.
And it starts with them defining what they want to achieve. So that's the goal part. And then you move into reality, and this is where the manager starts asking questions to really understand the current situation. So, what's working well? What isn't working so well? What challenges is this person facing?
That already sounds so much more collaborative than that typical top-down approach that a lot of managers seem to use.
100%. And it gets even more interesting. So in the options phase, the manager and the collaborator actually work together to try to brainstorm potential solutions. And I think what's so key here is that it's not the manager dictating the answers, it's about facilitating a process of discovery.
I love that. So it's really putting the responsibility on the team member to come up with the solutions, but you're also providing the support system to kind of guide them along the way.
Yeah.
And then there's the final step, which is willingness.
Yes. So this is where you're going to agree on those concrete next steps. You're going to set deadlines, make a follow-up plan, that kind of thing. It's all about turning those ideas from the brainstorming session into actionable steps.
This Gear OW model just seems like such a powerful tool,
Hmm.
especially if you're trying to move away from that more like command and control style of management
Right.
and move more towards a collaborative and empowering kind of environment.
Exactly. And you know what's really cool is this all connects so perfectly back with another one of Popwork's big themes, which is the importance of that regular constructive feedback.
Oh, yeah. I mean, they are really adamant about moving away from those like dreaded annual performance reviews and just integrating feedback into like the day-to-day workflow.
Yes. They have these golden rules for feedback, and one of the ones that really sticks with me is they say you should never wait for those annual reviews to give feedback.
I remember that. I was wondering, why do they think that immediate feedback is so important?
Well, here's the thing. The longer you wait to give someone feedback, the less impact it actually has.
Uh-huh.
Because think about it. Let's say someone made a mistake 6 months ago or did something really well 6 months ago, and you're just bringing it up now. It's just not going to resonate the same way as it would have if you had addressed it right away.
Yeah, because it's not top of mind for them anymore. They've already moved on to different projects and priorities.
Exactly. So giving timely feedback is what really drives improvement. It allows for those course corrections to happen in the moment, and it reinforces those positive behaviors while they're still fresh.
It really makes you wonder why so many companies are still clinging to those like once a year performance reviews, right?
Yeah.
If continuous feedback is supposed to be so much more effective.
Definitely. I think there are some systemic reasons for that, but yeah, it's something to think about, especially if you're trying to cultivate a team that's more agile and more responsive.
Okay, so we've got our rituals, we've got our consistent one-on-ones, we've got our focus on objectives, the GRO model for coaching, and frequent feedback. So Popwork is really like hitting all those key points of effective team management so far.
For sure. And we've got plenty more to unpack. I think one of the things that really intrigued me was their approach to communication.
Oh, yeah, they had some interesting points there. One of the tips that really stood out to me was when they said, prepare your message, but don't overthink it,
Yeah.
which I thought was kind of paradoxical.
Yeah, it is, but I think it speaks to this need for balance between clarity and authenticity. So while it's super important to think through what you want to communicate, especially if it's something important or maybe even a bit sensitive, if you over-rehearse, you can actually end up sounding really robotic and impersonal.
It's like when you're in a meeting and you can tell that someone is clearly reading from a script.
Yeah,
You can tell that their heart's not really in it. It just makes the whole interaction feel a bit weird.
totally. And I think Popwork really emphasizes that authentic communication is key, which involves being present, being genuine, and really listening to your team as much as you're talking to them.
There's that emphasis on active listening again. It's like a recurring theme for them,
Definitely.
which makes sense. It's a fundamental part of good communication. You need to create that space for your team to react and ask questions and share their perspectives.
Mhm.
It's not just about you delivering a message.
Right.
It's about creating a dialogue.
Ex-
Speaking of dialogue, we can't talk about Popwork without talking about their, I guess, borderline obsession with regular one-on-one meetings.
Yeah, for good reason, though. I mean, they really see these meetings as the backbone of effective team management.
Yeah, it is kind of interesting how much they emphasize those regular one-on-ones. Like they have all these specific guidelines. There should be weekly or bi-weekly, 30 to 60 minutes, not in the manager's office. It's almost like a ritual in itself.
Yeah, and I think that's very intentional. Like, they really see these meetings as this dedicated space for managers and team members to just connect, like on a human level, not just about like tasks and deadlines, but about their progress, challenges they're facing, even personal growth. And like we were talking about before, that consistency is so key, even when you're facing deadlines, even when you're stressed. That commitment to those regular one-on-ones really sends a powerful message.
Absolutely. So we've talked about communication, feedback, objectives, those all important one-on-ones. What else does Popwork really highlight as being crucial for effective team management?
Well, one thing that I was really impressed with was their focus on creating a supportive environment, especially when it comes to dealing with like challenging situations.
Okay.
They actually have this whole section in one of their guides dedicated to helping team members navigate those tough moments, which I think is pretty unique.
Yeah, I remember that. It's like a lot of the management advice out there really focuses on like hitting targets and driving results. But Popwork seems to get that people aren't robots. We all have those days where we need some extra support.
Exactly. And
Hmm.
they have some really insightful guidance for managers on how to actually offer that support without just like taking over. It's all about active listening, empathy, and helping that team member find solutions themselves.
I think that's such an important distinction, right? It's not about just swooping in and fixing things for them. It's more about being a guide, being a sounding board. Oh,
Yeah, exactly. It's about empowering them to kind of like work through that challenge themselves, maybe by connecting them with the right resources, sharing your own experience, or even just offering a safe space for them to process what's going on.
that makes sense. It almost seems like there's this like philosophical thread that runs through all of Popwork's advice.
Yeah.
They seem to really view management as more than just a set of tasks.
Hmm.
It's more about fostering growth, both the individual and the team as a whole.
That's a really great observation. And what I think is so fascinating is how they take that philosophy and weave it into this like really practical, actionable advice. Like, for example, they really encourage managers to regularly step back and reflect on their own management style. They even have these specific questions in their guides to like prompt that self-reflection.
Oh, like what am I doing well and what could I improve? That kind of thing.
Exactly. And they even suggest taking it a step further by like directly asking your team for a feedback on your management style.
Whoa. See, now that's brave.
Yeah.
I feel like a lot of managers would be pretty intimidated by that.
Yeah, maybe, but I think that willingness to be a little bit vulnerable, to admit that you don't have all the answers, and to actively seek feedback, that's what really builds trust, and
Yeah,
strengthens that manager-team relationship. It shows that you're committed to continuous improvement, not just for your team, but for yourself as a leader as well.
I like that. Okay, so I've got open communication, honesty, a willingness to be vulnerable. Those seem to be like pretty key themes in the pop work approach. But how does that actually play out in practice? Like, let's say things aren't going so well. How do they recommend handling bad news or difficult situations?
Well, you know how we talked about that emphasis on transparency and trust?
Mm-hmm.
Well, they apply that same principle to communicating during tough times.
Yeah, I remember them saying something about how it's so crucial to share both good and bad news with the team and to be as open and honest as possible.
Exactly. Their philosophy is that delaying information or trying to withhold information, even if you're doing it with the best of intentions, it can actually do more harm than good in the long run. It can lead to uncertainty, speculation, anxiety, things that can really damage team morale.
So even if the news is bad, it's better to just be upfront about it than to try and like sugarcoat things or even worse, keep people in the dark.
Exactly. That transparency builds trust, and that trust is absolutely essential for a team to function well, especially when they're facing challenges. And honestly, you should never underestimate your team's ability to handle difficult news. People are generally way more resilient than we give them credit for,
That's true.
and they really do appreciate honesty and authenticity from their leaders.
It's about treating them like adults
Right.
and respecting their ability to deal with whatever comes their way.
Yeah, exactly. So we've talked a lot about the like philosophical underpinnings of Popwork's approach.
Right.
But they also give a ton of practical tools and techniques for like the day-to-day of team management.
Oh, yeah, like that advice on how to run effective meetings, which, let's be real, can be a total minefield sometimes.
Oh, for sure. Meetings can turn into such a time suck if they're not properly structured or facilitated. And Popwork is all about structure. So, clear agendas, designated facilitators, time frames, all that good stuff.
Yeah, and I like how they're not just about trying to cram as much as possible into every meeting. They actually suggest using things like visual aids, encouraging everyone to participate, and even just incorporating a little bit of humor to keep things engaging.
Yeah, they really recognize that creating a more positive and engaging atmosphere can actually boost creativity and collaboration.
Right.
It's not just about efficiency, it's about creating that environment where people feel comfortable sharing their ideas and working together. And speaking of collaboration, Popwork has a lot to say about fostering that truly collaborative team environment.
Well, I bet they do, because collaboration is like the cornerstone of any team. But it doesn't always happen organically, does it?
It rarely does, and that's where proactive management really comes in. So Popwork really emphasizes building that foundation of trust, encouraging open communication, and creating those opportunities for your team members to learn from each other and their different strengths and expertise.
Yeah, and I noticed that they're also big fans of celebrating team victories, both big and small.
Absolutely. Celebrating success, no matter the size, reinforces those positive behaviors. It fosters this feeling of camaraderie, and it just reminds everyone that they're part of something bigger than themselves.
It's funny, as we're going through all these different aspects of Topwork's approach, I'm noticing a common thread.
Yeah.
It's like whether we're talking about communication, feedback, building a collaborative environment, they always seem to advocate for consistency and transparency above all else.
That's such a good observation. It's like they really want to build a culture where feedback is continuous, communication is honest, and everyone's clear on the goals. It's like this foundation of transparency and trust is what allows teams to truly thrive, even when they're faced with really big challenges.
It really is a very holistic approach.
Yeah.
It's not about just trying to fix isolated problems. It's about creating a sustainable system for effective teamwork.
Totally. And that's what makes Popwork's approach so compelling, you know? It's not just a random list of tips and tricks. They're offering this complete framework for how to build a really strong and thriving team.
That makes sense. I'm curious, though, how realistic is it for companies to actually put all of these principles into practice?
That's a good question.
It seems like it would require a pretty big shift for some organizations.
You're right. It's definitely not like a quick fix. It requires that commitment from leadership to actually embrace this more people-centric approach to management. But the potential benefits are huge.
Okay, cool. So we've covered a lot of ground here. It's clear that Popwork has a lot of really good information on effective team management.
I mean, we've just barely scratched the surface. Their guides are packed with insights and practical advice.
Yeah, it's really impressive.
Uh,
But before we wrap up today, I kind of want to zoom in on one more area. I know we've been dancing around it a little bit, but Popwork has some really specific advice on how to deal with conflict on a team. And let's face it, anytime you get a bunch of different personalities and work styles all together in one place, there's bound to be some friction.
Totally. It's pretty much inevitable. And I think a lot of managers really dread those moments. You know, like it's tempting to just try and avoid the conflict altogether or to smooth things over really quickly. But what Pockwork says is actually really interesting. They actually emphasize addressing those situations head on.
Which, again, seems to be a theme for them.
Yeah.
Just transparency and open communication no matter what's going on.
100%. They talk about creating a safe space where everyone feels comfortable expressing their perspective, you know, without feeling judged or worried about like repercussions. It's all about turning that friction into an opportunity to grow and learn.
Okay, that sounds good in theory, but how do you actually do that? Like, conflict can get really messy and emotional. How can a manager make sure those conversations stay constructive? Don't just turn into everyone pointing fingers and blaming each other.
Yeah, that's a good point. Well, Popwork really stresses the importance of the manager remaining neutral. So your job isn't to take sides or jump in with solutions. It's more about facilitating a productive dialogue where everyone feels heard and respected.
So it's more about being like a mediator than a judge.
Exactly. And they actually give some really practical tips for how to navigate these conversations. Like they recommend using a lot of open-ended questions so that everyone can fully share their perspective. And it's not about interrupting or jumping in with your own opinion. It's about actively listening and showing everyone that you're really trying to understand their point of view.
There's that emphasis on active listening again. It's really the foundation of so much of this stuff.
It really is.
Whether it's feedback or one-on-ones or navigating conflict.
Totally. It goes hand in hand with creating that sense of safety and openness. People are way more likely to open up if they know that they're being heard and understood.
Right. Okay, so let's say you've facilitated this open and honest conversation and everyone's had the chance to share their piece. What's next? How do you actually get from conflict to resolution?
Well, Popwork suggests working together with everyone to find a solution that addresses, everyone's concerns. So this might involve some compromise, it might involve tweaking some processes or roles, but the key is that it's a shared solution, not something that's just imposed by the manager.
I could see how that could be pretty challenging, especially if the conflict runs really deep or there are some like strong personalities involved.
Mm.
But if you can actually get buy-in from everyone, it seems like it would be much more sustainable in the long run.
For sure. And it's not even just about like finding the solution, it's about the follow-up as well. Popwork emphasizes checking in regularly to make sure that whatever you've all agreed on is actually working. and to be open to making adjustments if you need to.
So again, it goes back to that consistency and ongoing communication. It's not just a one and done type of thing.
Exactly. And I think that really highlights how interconnected all of Popwork's advice is. Whether it's feedback, setting objectives, communication, conflict resolution, it's all part of this bigger system for creating a team that's cohesive and high performing.
You know, I have to say, this whole deep dive has been super eye-opening for me. I think Popwork's approach to management is so refreshing. It's people-centric, it's practical, and it just makes you think about how you can make work a more positive and supportive place for everyone.
I totally agree. And even though we've covered a lot today, this is really just the tip of the iceberg. I'd really encourage everyone listening to check out Popwork's resources. I mean, their website is packed with great information.
Awesome. Well, a huge thank you to you for walking us through all this and sharing all your great insights. I always love having you on the show.
It was my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And to everyone listening out there, thanks for joining us for another deep dive. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this one. You know, if you had to pick just one Popwork principle to apply to your own team, which one would you choose and why? Hit us up on social media. We're always down for a good conversation. Until next time, happy managing.